Welcome to the podcast. I'm your host, Casey. Yes, the quality of the video is down a bit tonight because um, the camera that I ordered to please my viewers um, was basically only works during the daytime. So I'm doing a nighttime episode anyway, and that's this. So thank you for being here. Today's episode is on Henry David Thoreau. And of course, we're talking about Thoreau in light of recent events. That's all I'll say. I also went running this morning, and it was too cold out, and I've got this like throat. Basically, I coughed up half a lung. So be patient with me if I have the sniffles. All right, so at the beginning of the first chapter of Henry Thoreau's Walden, which is titled after the name of the pond on the banks of which he lived in a very small hand-built shack for 2 years, about a mile from Concord. He begins with an epigraph to announce his purpose. And I love this epigraph. It always stuck with my head even before I really understood it. He says, quote, "I do not propose to write an ode to dejection, but to brag as lustily as a chanticleer on his roost, if only to wake my neighbors." Isn't that great? Like, to write an ode to dejection would be like depression, right? I'm not sad, he's saying here. But instead, to brag as lustily as a rooster, a chanticleer on his roost, if only to wake my neighbors. So that's kind of the tone that he strikes, or the note that he strikes at the beginning of Walden. And what does he mean? I mean, in what way are his neighbors asleep? Oh, by the way, I think I may drop a couple of like visuals into this episode. So if you're still here, stay tuned. I'll try to throw a couple in here from old slideshows. Anyway, so in what way are his neighbors asleep, and in what way is he awake? He gets into a clarification almost immediately after sort of making an apology for writing so informally in the first person in the third paragraph. And I want to read this one to you here because it's a little dense. Thoreau writes like a man who reads, and he expects his readers to read at that level. He once said he could not live without spending 4 hours a day walking and another 4 reading. Nevertheless, in spite of the big words and sometimes meandering syntax, somehow, when I was 15 and found my dad's old copy of Walden, which, by the way, I showed you, I still have. I had to duct tape the binding, but that's it. The book became my first favorite, grown-up book. So anyway, here's paragraph 3 of chapter 1, and I'll add my commentary to try to clarify as we go. He says, quote, "I would fain say something, not so much concerning the Chinese and Sandwich Islanders, as you who read these pages, who are said to live in New England, something about your condition, especially your outward condition or circumstances in this world, in this town, what it is, whether it is necessary that it be as bad as it is, whether it cannot be improved as well as not." So he starts out by saying, I'm not here to write, an Edward Said book about the other side of the world or about really humankind either. Really, I'm focused on you people in Concord and your life in 1848 or 1852 or whenever you publish this. He says, continuing, "I have traveled a good deal in Concord, and everywhere, in shops and offices and fields, the inhabitants have appeared to me to be doing penance in 1,000 remarkable ways." Penance, of course, is, like from the Catholic tradition where you have to do essentially like, make up praying or whatever after the sin, after the confession. And sometimes, of course, in the Middle Ages, it took the form of things like, self-flagellation and wearing the cilice, the hair shirt thing, and so on. So he's saying, I look around Concord and it seems that people are making themselves extremely uncomfortable as if they're doing penance. He continues, quote, "What I have heard of Brahmins sitting exposed to 4 fires and looking in the face of the sun," you got to picture that, or hanging suspended, quote, "until it becomes impossible for them to resume their natural position while from the twist of the neck, nothing but liquids can pass into their stomach. So they would take these crazy yoga poses, with their heads turned around and never undo them. Or, continuing, or dwelling, chained for life at the foot of a tree, or measuring with their bodies like caterpillars the breadth of vast empires, or standing on one leg on the tops of pillars. Even these forms of conscious penance are hardly more incredible and astonishing than the scenes which I daily witness in Concord. So those scenes you've heard of, like Saint Simeon's stylites he climbed up on one of those old Greek columns and just stayed up there for the rest of his life, or the thing about measuring the breadth of empires. There was a movie called Wheel of Time I saw not too long ago about pilgrimages they would make from like places like Mongolia all the way to northern India by foot, and not just by foot, but take one step, say I don't know, some Buddhist prayer, and then like prostrate yourself, full prostration, face down, get up, forehead to the ground, get up, take one more step, do it again, right? So he says, even these are hardly more incredible and astonishing than the scenes which I daily witness in Concord. The 12 labors of Hercules were trifling in comparison with those which my neighbors have undertaken. For they were only 12 and had an end. But I could never see that these men slew or captured any monster or finished any labor. They have no friend Iolas to burn with a hot iron the root of the Hydra's head, but as soon as one head is crushed, two spring up. This would be the whack-a-mole that we played at, Chuck E. Cheese as a kid or something, right? So, this seems to be his effort to justify the project of living alone in the woods and the justification for his observations about that project. The problem is modern life, this new way of doing things that didn't exist 50 years before Thoreau's time. Everybody is throwing themselves into it, but not Henry. He has some questions, some objections, and he can't readily understand why no one else is asking these questions. They seem obvious to him. It is in this sense that Thoreau is woke and most of his countrymen are slumbering. But once you realize that that is the frame for this entire book, you have to also see that you're reading a loser's history. This is a sort of tense thing to realize because if you think that Thoreau is right in his observations and his criticisms, then you have to also see that everyone basically ignored him, and America took a different direction than the one he recommended. The sleepers, the walking dead, so to speak, seem to have decided the direction of history, in America at least. Of course, in the 1850s, it's very clear what Thoreau was thinking about and where his thinking comes from. Yes, Emerson was a huge influence. He lived with Emerson, in fact, for a time, but there's a better explanation for all this talk about nature between about 1836 and 1852, and that is the rise of, industrialism, capitalism, factory jobs. These jobs are the beginning of urbanization, of the move away from the agrarian ideal imagined by Jefferson as perfectly tailored for America and Americans. And yes, this was before the labor reform movements of the late 19th century, so in some cases these laborers really were playing whack-a-mole, sometimes working 12-hour days, 6 days a week in order to pay their bills. A few paragraphs later, Thoreau adds some emphasis. Quote, I sometimes wonder that we can be so frivolous, I may almost say, as to attend to the gross but somewhat foreign form of servitude called Negro slavery. There are so many keen and subtle masters that enslave both North and South. It is hard to have a Southern overseer. It is worse to have a Northern one. But worst of all is when you are the slave driver of yourself. Talk of a divinity in man. Look at the teamster on the highway, wending to market by day or night. Does any divinity stir within him? His highest duty to fodder and water his horses. End quote. It's interesting to note that in Europe, the 1848 revolutions were conscious of the pressures created by capitalism, and there was a longing there for something more ideal and frankly less exploitative. Eventually, they were talking about, Joseph Proudhon and Saint Simon and Fourier and even Marx. But in America, no such movements arose. Maybe it was because America was so young, hadn't even really built its cities much yet. In any case, instead of Marx, instead of the suggestions for reforming the system, America produced Emerson and Thoreau. They have the same complaints about capitalism, but their solution seems to be to turn away. You have agency. You have agency, man. Just say no to this crazy new model of economics. Remember why you live and what you live for. You are one of God's own children. Don't settle for a 9 to 5, or really it would be more like, 7 to 6 grind in a cubicle or a coal shoveling factory or whatever, driving horses, or whatever petty thing pays the bills. That's not good enough for you. What is amazing is the balance of optimism and skepticism that we find in Thoreau. He is in some ways the most non-conforming of all philosophers, but for all that, he hardly bats an eye. He loses no confidence. He says again in chapter 1, quote, "The greater part of what my neighbors call good, I believe in my soul to be bad. And if I repent of anything, it is very likely to be my good behavior. What demon possessed me that I behaved so well? You may say the wisest thing you can, old man, you who have lived 70 years, not without honor of a kind. I hear an irresistible voice which invites me away from all that. One generation abandons the enterprises of another like stranded vessels." Thoreau is a bit rough on the older generation, but it's because most of them seem to have finally decided and committed to a way of life and a direction that Thoreau still believes is and should be questionable. In my lifetime, the ways of baby boomers, were sort of given to me with my artificial, scientifically better baby formula. And these ways of the boomers were received before consciousness, like a circumcision. But for all that, am I obliged to honor their conclusions? I hope not. I find much of what the baby boomers decided to be naive and even ruinous. Sorry, this is a forward-looking rejection of the status quo. And this points us in the direction of Thoreau's most famous essay, Resistance to Civil Government, also known as Civil Disobedience. Before we get to that, I want to quote a bit from chapter 2 of Walden, which certainly has the best chapter title in the book, quote, "Where I Lived and What I Lived For." At the beginning of the chapter, Thoreau encourages readers to reflect long and hard before committing to a home, like to buy one, or a location. He is a wanderer, and in wandering he finds the spirit of life. So he advises, quote, "As long as possible, live free and uncommitted. It makes but little difference whether you are committed to a farm or the county jail." This uncommitted life might strike some as hopelessly unmoored, and yes, like any philosopher, Thoreau questions the catechism more than once. Received wisdom will always be second best to experience as a way of knowing, and he's determined to find out for himself. Here's maybe his most famous paragraph in the book. He says, quote, "I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life, and see if I could not learn what it had to teach, and not, when I came to die, discover that I had not lived. I did not wish to live what was not life, living is so dear, nor did I wish to practice resignation unless it was quite necessary. I wanted to live deep and suck out all the marrow of life, to live so sturdily and Spartan-like as to put to rout all that was not life, to cut a broad swath and shave close, to drive life into a corner and reduce it to its lowest terms, And if it proved to be mean, why then to get the whole and genuine meanness of it, and publish its meanness to the world. Or if it were sublime, to know it by experience, and be able to give a true account of it in my next excursion. For most men, it appears to me, are in a strange uncertainty about it, whether it is of the devil or of God, and have somewhat hastily concluded that it is the chief end of man here to glorify God and enjoy him forever. Drink time. It's interesting to think about what it means to live what is not life. I suppose, like, doing things that we don't prefer to do at some level, right? So all the time you're at your job or doing, chores and so on. Anyway, I think I think only the most orthodox religious person would complain about that paragraph. And even then, it would probably only be the, zealot convert to orthodoxy, thinking of his own youthful mistakes. And in my view, this is, the thing I just read from Thoreau, in my view, is a very healthy attitude for someone in his 20s or for a man who hasn't married and had kids yet. Question everything, reject what seems false. And this attitude includes many an admonition against merely observing. That won't do. Instead, Thoreau encourages participation and action. For instance, I've always loved what he says about the news. Quote, I am sure that I never read any memorable news in a newspaper. If we read of one man robbed or murdered or killed by accident, or one house burned, or one vessel wrecked, or one steamboat blown up, or one cow run over on the Western Railroad, or one mad dog killed, or one lot of grasshoppers in the winter, we need never read of another. One is enough. If you're acquainted with the principle, what do you care for a myriad instances and applications? To a philosopher, all news, as it is called, is gossip, and they who edit and read it are old women over their tea. Yet not a few are greedy after this gossip. So, and no offense, old women, but So I say get away from all that, man. Learn how to swing a hammer, for goodness sake. So many have heard Jesus talk about being fishers of men. Everybody wants to be a fisher of men, but they haven't even learned how to fish yet. One of my favorite scenes in the book is when Thoreau accidentally drops a hammer through his ice fishing hole about 20 feet down. But the water is so clear that he can see it down there on the bottom of the pond. So he describes his project for the rest of the day, which was, of course, figuring out how to recover the sunk hammer. He manages, of course. This isn't to say put away the books. As I said, he read for 4 hours a day. But put away the drivel, the shallow books, the ones that aren't written in stone. We'll have no Noah Yuval Harari here, no Steven Pinker, no Malcolm Gladwell. That shit is ephemeral, like the news. No thank you. Thoreau says, quote, shams and delusions are esteemed for soundest truths, while reality is fabulous. If men would steadily observe realities only and not allow themselves to be deluded, life, to compare it with such things as we know, would be like a fairy tale and the Arabian Nights entertainments. If we respected only what is inevitable and has a right to be, music and poetry would resound along the streets. When we are unhurried and wise, we perceive that only great and worthy things have any permanent and absolute existence, that petty fears and petty pleasures are but the shadow of reality. This is always exhilarating and sublime. By closing the eyes and slumbering, and consenting to be deceived by shows, men establish and confirm their daily life of routine and habit everywhere, which still is built on purely illusory foundations. Children who play life discern its true law and relations more clearly than men who fail to live it worthily, but who think that they are wiser by experience, that is, by failure. End quote. Of course, this is highfalutin romanticism, man. Students used to always feel like challenged by this stuff, and then they would seek a way to dismiss it so that they wouldn't have to change their lives, basically. So, he's unrealistic, they'd always say. Or, I need to pay my bills, or, whatever. I can't afford land to live like this. Yeah, maybe. Maybe that's true. Maybe we're totally stuck with no recourse, basically slaves. Well, if so, what can we do about it? So this is where, on to civil disobedience, or resistance to civil government is the formal title of it. The essay has been claimed by both major American parties on and off for 170 years or so since it was published, and also by libertarians and anarchists, of course. The pressing issues at the time really were the Mexican-American War, which Thoreau did not want to support, and slavery, which again Thoreau did not want to be associated with. But about halfway through the essay, he makes a really salient point that seems to go even further. He says, quote, "It is for no particular item in the tax bill that I refuse to pay it. I simply wish to refuse allegiance to the state, to withdraw and stand aloof from it effectually. I do not care to trace the course of my dollar, if I could, till it buys a man, or a musket to shoot one with. The dollar is innocent, but I am concerned to trace the effects of my allegiance. In fact, I quietly declare war with the state, after my fashion, though I will still make use and get what advantages of her I can, as is usual in such cases." End quote. What an amazing quote. Like, that is so beyond base, isn't it? Like, he's basically going to take advantage of what he can from the government, but doesn't want to be, formally in allegiance to it. This is the foundational, famous anti-government essay that inspired Gandhi and Mr. Riots Are the Language of the Unheard, Martin Luther King Jr. And I gotta say, it holds up. It really does. It raises a really interesting point, I think, which is, are citizens morally culpable for the immoral or unjust acts committed by their government if they do not resist paying taxes? I've been paying taxes for almost 20 years now. I wonder how many Patriot missiles I've subsidized, It's not a happy thought. There are just so many great paragraphs in this essay, but also excellent aphorisms, quotable even without context. At one point, Thoreau quips, after remarking that he was not born to be forced, quote, "If a plant cannot live according to nature, it dies, and so a man." End quote. Isn't that awesome? And of course, what he means here is basically, is that reason to let yourself be forced? He goes, nah. Basically, if they're gonna kill you, they're gonna kill you. It's just amazing that he can say that stuff. Anyway, here's another aphorism from Thoreau. He says, "Under a government which imprisons unjustly, the true place for a just man is also a prison." Words to live by, maybe. I hope not, but it has a kind of sense to it, doesn't it? Part of Thoreau's beef with America, and he definitely has one, saying at one point, quote, "How does it become a man to behave toward the American government today? I answer that he cannot without disgrace be associated with it." End quote. Part of his beef with America is actually with democracy itself. Like an absolute savage, he has no patience for voting and thinks it beneath him, it seems. Listen to this. What a great paragraph. He says, quote, "All voting is a sort of gaming, like checkers or backgammon, with a slight moral tinge to it. a playing with right and wrong, with moral questions, and betting naturally accompanies it, the character of the voters is not staked. I cast my vote, perchance, as I think right, but I'm not vitally concerned that the right should prevail. I'm willing to leave it to the majority. Its obligation, therefore, never exceeds that of expediency. Even voting for the right is doing nothing for it. It is only expressing to men feebly your desire that it should prevail. End quote. Pathetic, isn't it, you voters? This should be an insult, voters. Get off your asses and do something, he says. I mean, so in so many words. Demand a better government at once. Not in the future, but now, damn it. And not only after you've convinced the majority. If you're confident that you're the wise minority, if you really know, don't wait for the permission of a dullard majority. And for what it's worth, the origin of Thoreau's thinking here seems to be not political, but spiritual or sort of theological. He's a transcendentalist, after all. He learned from the Bible, from Confucius, from Emerson, and most of all from the pond, not from Montesquieu or Locke or whatever, right? Near the end of the essay on civil disobedience, he says, quote, "They who know of no purer sources of truth, who have traced up its stream no higher, stand, and wisely stand, by the Bible and the Constitution, and drink at it there with reverence and humanity. But they who behold where it comes trickling into this lake or that pool, gird up their loins once more, and continue their pilgrimage toward its fountainhead." If you're an idealist or a Platonist, a philosopher, you should love this, I think, and maybe even try to live by it. He really resists the idea that truth can be institutionalized, right? So the Bible, the Constitution, it's like, that stuff's fine. It's even good. But, someone had to conceive of that stuff, right? So the sun shines today also, to quote Emerson, like, realize it for yourself from your own experience. So I want to sort of conclude or begin to conclude with a callback to Walden, this time to something from chapter 5, which is called Solitude. In the Emerson episode, I promised I would read this as a companion excerpt to the part where Emerson describes himself feeling like a transparent eyeball. Both of these writers, and many who followed them, promise a sort of new birth, the receiving of a higher mind, if you can really commit to learning to read and follow nature's edicts. In Emerson's essay, Nature, his first recommendation, as I said then, and really his command in the sense that he suggests this route isn't optional. The first thing he says is to go into solitude. Thoreau certainly echoes that teaching in chapter 5 of Walden. I'm going to read it to you in just a second. But I've been thinking about solitude lately. Like, doesn't it feel like, there's it's the fear of missing out, I guess, that's driving us, right? Like, why do we keep showing up in the comments section, on Twitter, watching the news? We know it's bullshit. We know that we can spend our time better. We know we're halfway through our lives or more. Like, what are we doing here? But part of it, I think, is that we're afraid to be truly alone with just our memory and our experience and like our bodies, and sort of pause long enough to kind of like let it all in and start to process it. Anyway, that's me. I think Thoreau says it better. Listen to what he says here. Because in that processing, sorry, this isn't him yet, but in that processing of it, or in the reflecting and so on, I think that's where, like, what is that? That's where you find, peace. That's where your life starts to take on a meaning that makes sense to you. and things, start to come together. So Thoreau says it like this. He says, "I have never felt lonesome or in the least oppressed by a sense of solitude but once. And that was a few weeks after I came to the woods, when, for an hour, I doubted if the near neighborhood of man was not essential to a serene and healthy life. To be alone was something unpleasant, but I was at the same time conscious of a slight insanity in my mood and seemed to foresee my recovery. In the midst of a gentle rain, while these thoughts prevailed, I was suddenly sensible of such sweet and beneficent society in nature, in the very pattering of the drops, and in every sound and sight around my house, an infinite and unaccountable friendliness all at once like an atmosphere sustaining me, as made the fancied advantages of human neighborhood insignificant, and I have never thought of them since. Every little pine needle expanded and swelled with sympathy and befriended me. I was so distinctly made aware of the presence of something kindred to me, even in scenes which we are accustomed to call wild and dreary, and also that the nearest blood to me and humanist was not a person nor a villager, that I thought no place could ever be strange to me again." End quote. Man, I mean, that is nice, isn't it? That is awesome. What a promise, you know? Doesn't that sound good? No place could ever be strange to me again. Everywhere you go, home. Doesn't that sound good? Don't you want that? Nietzsche would go on to affirm this idea a couple decades later, not exactly quoting Thoreau. I guess he discovered it himself, but that suggests the truth of it. He says, quote, this is in Zarathustra, so it's, he's like preaching, sort of. "With your love and with your creating, go into your solitude, my brother. Only much later will justice limp after you. With my tears, go into your solitude, my brother. I love him who seeks to create beyond himself, and thus perishes." Thus spoke Zarathustra. Or as Melville said of Emerson, "I love all men who dive." Right? Well, to dive, you basically got to do it alone. I know that in the kind of what are we now? What movement is this? Basically the not progressive, not utopian movement that, it's basically illegal these days, but like I know that there's some antipathy sometimes to talk about individualism. And that is one of Thoreau's major themes. But I also think that that is where God and the muses or whatever sort of enter this world, sort of through an individual who has gone beyond the buoys in some way, right? So in order to do that, or you can think of someone scuba diving. You can't scuba dive as a group. Everyone has their own tank. You do it alone at some level, right? In other words, turn off this YouTube nonsense. Get away from the news. Go for a walk under the stars. Recall that you have a body and that it's aging, but that through it you know the creation, and through that you know the Creator. And that is a miracle, folks. Wake up, you sleepers. Ah, I love this stuff. I love it. Anyway, I am about done there with Thoreau. I'm making good progress on Herodotus. Really interesting read. A lot of stuff on Egypt. I just finished book 2 today. And I kind of wish there was more actually, but you have to, in your head, you have to start to figure out what a stade is or whatever all those ancient measurements were, because he'll be the causeway leading up to the Great Pyramid was 6 stades long, and you really have to slow down and learn what those measurements are in order to appreciate the scenes that or the Temple of Hephaestus was so how, and it's I don't know. It's fun to try to read through that, and you go slow. So I'm going slow. I'm not ready to do an episode on Herodotus, is what I'm saying. Um, so for the next episode, I was thinking the book of Jonah would be a really good one. I mean, I'm trying to keep it kind of relevant these days because, man, is it just me or is the news like? I am still watching it. I haven't totally turned it off. I still pay attention, what even if it's just on Twitter or something. But like pure, just absolute. You know what it is? It's like it's got to be that these people in the city are like, I guess they're fearful of losing their status, and their fear is that like a bunch of savages are just gonna come get them, and so every day that that doesn't happen, they become more and more frightened, which leads to a kind of paranoia, you know? So then they take their private, their private driver in a limousine or whatever, picks them up at their home in, Montauk or whatever, and then drives them into the city where they do their CNN headline stuff. And in their minds, they're just picturing like people like me, just regular people, normal people, like with pitchforks and the crazy, the white supremacist Nazis and stuff. And it's like, oh man, they've lost touch. They've lost touch. But of course, they own the media, don't they? They own it. And so so what? So I guess like they're gonna make you look like the crazy one if you talk too much about it. But anyway, so Jonah. I thought Jonah would be good next because Jonah is basically told by God to go into Washington, D.C. and which is Nineveh at the time, and tell them all that they're being degenerates and they should repent. And just like a human, Jonah doesn't want to, So we will talk about that and about like sort of what that story might indicate in 2021. And how you might go about being an actual Jonah or why you might not, and what will happen if you don't, and so on. So you are absolutely required to read the book of Jonah if you've never read it, at least, for the next episode. It's only 3 pages, you guys. It's like, I think it's one of the shortest books at least in the Old Testament. The Old Testament. And so even my listeners can probably manage 3 pages in the Old Testament. The Patreon page is in the description below. I really do appreciate the support of those who have already signed up. It means a lot. And if you did already sign up, we're due for our next secret private stream Skull and Bones meeting on Friday, January 15th, I believe. We'll do it at 9 p.m. And I don't have a topic picked out yet, but I was thinking like civil disobedience, insurrection, that kind of thing would be fun to talk about. It seems pretty fruitless and hapless and diluted to me, by the way, to participate in that stuff. So if I were you, I would not. But like I said, I mean, for like, isn't it fun to hear Thoreau say, excuse me, say things like, where was that part where he says basically like who the thing about being associated with, he says this: how does it become a man to behave toward the American government today? I answer that he cannot without disgrace be associated with it. And like, I love that. Like, you can say that. Did you know you can say that? That's a constitutional right. And you're not treasonous or anything. You're just saying it is a disgraceful government with a disgraceful set of leaders passing disgraceful laws, and it tries to make a mockery out of you. So spiritually dissociate from it if you like. Okay, this is the outro music. Thanks for listening.